Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our How-To series, and today we're focusing on how to fund aged care. So today's discussion, we're talking about 10 things to consider when selling the family home as part of that discussion. Today, importantly, I'm joined by our star in this space, Kerry Darton, who's our Accredited Aged Care Professional. So welcome, Kerry.
Thank you, Mark.
All right, so we might get started. So a very tight time frame, half an hour, so we'll 10 topics, but we'll flick through them quickly, and if there's any questions, we'll address them at the end.
Okay.
All right, number one, are you retaining a level of control, and do you have options? Selling the home, Kerry, let's elaborate on that.
Okay, so quite often people think when someone's going into aged care that they need to sell the family home. Mm-hmm. So they find out what the RAD is, which is often about 450, 500,000, can be as low as 200, 300, but quite often we're seeing it around 450 to 550.
The RAD, the residential accommodation deposit.
Yep. So it's the cost of buying your accommodation in the aged care facility. And so the knee-jerk reaction is we've got to come up with this lump sum. We've got to sell the house. So today is talking you through some of the things to consider before you make that decision, because sometimes it can impact how much government support you get, how much you're paying for the care and other things. So we just have come up with 10 points today that we're quickly going to run through on different things that you may not have taken into consideration before you make this decision. So this whole thing about today is take a step back, look at what your options are before you rush in and make decisions, because they can have financial impacts. But some of them, the first point here in particular is about the mental health. So people tend to be going into an aged care facility when there's a crisis. And so there's a whole lot of stress. And this first point is about not underestimating the importance of that mental health for the person who's going into care. And also, this is a significant change in their lifestyle and in their living arrangements. And it may actually be that it's not the appropriate decision. Hopefully, it is the appropriate decision, and hopefully, you're going down the right avenue. But if you need to turn around and back out of this, if you've sold the house, you've closed that door already. And so this is about potentially leaving that decision whilst for 3 to 6 months, whilst you settle down, whilst you de-stress a little, you make some decisions, and you've got a better understanding of what's happening.
One of the things that you've often said to me is that when you're talking to clients, the elderly person that's going into care actually doesn't think they're going in there permanently. Yeah. So they actually think they're going to come out shortly. So it's a temporary arrangement.
Yeah, and there's resistance to going into it. And it's like, and if you're selling the house, it's very permanent for that person. Yeah. So this is about going, well, the house is still there, Mum and Dad. We can, if we need to, you can move back home. If your health if your health improves, then there's potentially the option of going back to. Yeah. The reality is, until COVID hit, it wasn't a common thing, but we are seeing more and more now because of what's happening, COVID, and there's reduction in the number of visits that you can have. People have rethought that aged care, that care arrangement, and are looking at potentially going back to in-home care. The other thing is that the person's circumstances may change. So at the time, the informal carers, so you may not be in a position with your work to help your parents at home, but in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, circumstances may change, and you may be able to change the care arrangement. So that's just that. This first point is really about the mental health of the person that's going in, and leaving your options open if you decide, or they decide, or the crisis, once it's under control and the medication is being taken, or the appropriate care and feeding, not feeding, but menu.
So I suppose the takeaway from that is that understand the importance of how the home can act as a transitional arrangement. Yep. So the impact from a mental wellness point of view. Think about the broader options. So what do you do with contents in your home, going into storage and those sort of things? And maybe the option is potentially not the right option ultimately, and then you may have to reverse that decision and have care at home, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So our next point is this is about legislation, and this is about a calculation more so than a mental health. So the home from an aged care fee perspective is capped. So you can have $1 million home that when you go into care and your means tested fee is based on your income and assets, that $1 million isn't counted as $1 million when they're calculating the fees. It's capped currently at $171,000. So it's about potentially having a lower fee. If you sell the house and you've got $1 million and you've used some of that to pay your RAD, then you still have $1 million worth of assets that's counting towards your means tested fee, rather than having the value of the home capped at $171,000.
Okay.
Number 3, again, this is a legislation consideration. When you're on a pension and when you're accessing aged care from a Centrelink perspective, the home is an exempt asset, and the home can remain an exempt asset for 2 years from when you become a permanent resident into aged care. So for that, you've got a 2-year window to really make your decision about what you want to do with the house without it impacting your age pension entitlements. So,
okay, and so that's another great financial impact it can have. I suppose with that there, at what point? So if we have someone there who does go into care, and we've got a 2-year exemption, you start inviting them back in for a review at what time with that position?
We say that, like, we usually do a 12-month cash flow for people as part of the plan. Mm-hmm. So this is what your fees are going to look like for the next 12 months. But with the home, we say really but in that 12 to 18 months is a good time to start looking at what options, like, does the house need to be had some work done to it, renovations done. There's also that lag time of putting the house onto the market and marketing it and selling it and going through the contract and stuff. So we tend to say to people, look, do the set of the cash flow for 12 months. Within that 12 to 18 months, you really start to need to have that conversation, because in 2 years' time, that house is going to count, and so you're potentially going to be losing that income stream of the age pension.
Okay, so I understand the first 12 months cash flow.
Yeah.
The second 12 months, so leading up to that 2 years, is because it is going to be no longer exempt. Work through in advance what that cash flow is going to look like. So if you need to sell the home, there are actions you can take. So we're not getting to the 2-year period, being assessed and going, now, look, we're forced into a position here, we need to sell a home, but you're not prepared for renovations and optimizing your market.
Yeah.
So,
and usually people are resistant to letting go of their home in that first 12 months, but they've sort of been in that aged care facility and they're more comfortable with what their new arrangement, and so it's one less change in that first 12 months, but then it's important to actually do some planning before you get to the 2 years and lose that income stream potentially.
Yeah.
Okay, estate intentions. Do you understand the estate intentions? Now, this is surprisingly, this is very common with our clients, that we think that we can sell the home and pay the accommodation costs for the aged care facility, but then we find out that a house has been left to one child and the commercial, industrial properties or investment properties have been left to other children. And if we sell one of those assets, it's then paid to the aged care facility and it comes back as cash. And so sometimes an estate can actually, by selling an asset, we can write somebody out of a will, because the cash may be distributed to grandchildren and the property being distributed to siblings. So estate intentions are something that really need to be considered. We don't like to talk about our wills. We don't like to talk about end of life and what's going to happen. So quite often the will is prohibitive for us to do certain things without unintended consequences from an estate perspective.
I think that's a really important one, because it's one that's going through that moment. The real focus is on funding and getting the parent or person into care. There's a couple of things around that there. One is, understanding the will and the specific bequeathing arrangements in place, because that's what you're referring to there, that how it can have an unintended consequence of that. I think the second one to that too is understand that if you are paying a RAD, that, and it's not uncommon for us to see, within clients, that sometimes the funding of that can come from the children. And often it might be one that might be in a better financial position than another child. So if they, pay the RAD for a parent, that the RAD repayment comes back to the estate.
Yeah. So there's a couple of dangers with children helping out with paying the RAD. And one of the things that we talk to people about is helping with ongoing cash flow rather than paying lump sums. And the reason for that is that from an estate perspective, there's not one of our clients, but we've heard recently somebody was telling me a story about a brother who'd paid a brother had paid the RAD, or the accommodation cost is the refundable accommodation deposit to go into a facility. When that money was returned to the estate, there was nothing in the will to say the brother would be refunded the money. And there was no informal
loan agreements and making sure you get legal advice around that and making sure the documentation is important there.
Because in that case, the executor distributed to the 5 children, and then the uncle said, well, what about my 500,000? And they're like, oh, there was no provision in the will for that. So it's just making sure. But the other probably key thing about the estate intentions is understanding, and this is sort of not just about the home, but making sure that the powers of attorney are in place and that the will is appropriate for this time. Because quite often when somebody is going into an aged care facility, they may not have the capacity to change the will. So you need to understand what those intentions are and make sure that you're not unwinding those intentions. So halfway there. Do you understand if someone qualifies as a protected person? So this is another thing that sometimes gets overlooked when somebody is looking at how to fund aged care, is that there may be a protected person that goes in to. So
do you want to just clarify what that protected person is?
So a protected person is the number one is a spouse. So if you have a spouse and they are staying in the house, then the house is an exempt asset. If you have a dependent child under the age of 16, then they're also a protected person. But then there's 2 other qualifications, and there's quite a few rules around them, but it's whether a carer has been, who has been receiving an income support pension, has been in the house and living in the house for 2 years, or if there's a family member who has been living in the house for 5 years and is on income support as well. Then they're counted as a protected person, and that preserves the exempt asset of the home, which is important with the fee calculation for the aged care facility, but it's also important for the pension calculation. So if a person is qualifying for an age pension, and we have a lot of people who go, but we don't qualify for an age pension. One of the things about being going into an aged care facility is from an age care, pension perspective, the money that you pay for accommodation, which the acronym is RAD, the money that you pay for that is an exempt asset. So what we find is that quite often people now become eligible for an age pension. So it's just about making sure that you're not selling down an asset that is then preventing you from getting other assistance. And if there's a protected person who can stay in the house, then that's an added bonus.
So I think my key takeaway from that is to seek advice around your funding arrangements, or your possible funding arrangements. Yeah. All right, one that's non-financial.
Non-financial and very emotional. Yeah, very important. So sometimes this doesn't necessarily have to be the family home. Sometimes we'll have a situation where we have a holiday home that's one of the assets, and the family's been going there for 30 years, and the generations have been going there, and you want to preserve that asset. Selling that to fund going into aged care is not always the best option. So sometimes the decision isn't a financial decision. So what getting advice does and helps you is understanding those the implications of those decisions. So what happens if we keep that house? How do we fund it? And what are the implications on the costs? And what are the implications on the age pension? So, and sometimes it may just be that there is one child who is going to inherit from their parents, and they may want to keep that family home for themselves or for their children. And so it's not a financial decision, but it is. That's why we've said sentimental value. There are sometimes considerations that don't stack up financially necessarily, but are still a good decision to retain the home. Number 7, does one member of the couple qualify for low means? Okay, so the reason we threw this one into the mix is that sometimes the decision is, I've got to sell the house because my husband has to go into care, but then that will free up assets. That means that they will be classified as a full bed paying resident. If the home is retained and there's somebody staying in the house, it remains as an exempt asset, and that there's a protected person in that house. And so the person may be classified as a low means resident. And so they don't pay the published full rate for that bed. There's a calculation, and the acronym that's used for that is a RAC, which is a refundable accommodation contribution. And so just that low means when you're going from one family unit to now you're having to fund 2 family units, really. It's sometimes important to keep that house rather than sell the house, downsize, and end up with a low means. Like you potentially want them to go in as low means.
And to elaborate on what that would mean.
So low means, so for example, we had a client recently that late last year, that they signed the full bed price to go into the facility.
Yep.
They were going to be charged $550,000. They went in as a low means because the mother was leaving the mother staying in the home. The house wasn't counted, and we saved them $970 a fortnight on their fees for that, because he was classified as low means, so he didn't have to pay the published rate.
Okay, one that this is a difficult one. This one.
Yeah, because we can't give. Yeah,
it's a very difficult one because what Kerry's referring to here is potential capital growth of the property. So the consideration here is that if you do sell a property, then what happens with the residual capital? And whatever you do with that residual capital, does it take into consideration what are the risks associated with that? Because typically the person who's actually making those decisions might be under a power of attorney. That'd be fair to say.
Yep.
So when we look at this, the issue here is that under a power of attorney, you're looking at you're putting yourself in the shoes there. And so as an advisor, if we're looking at this, we're saying, well, what is the investment time frame and what are the risks associated with an appropriate investment for a person who's gone into aged care? Often the case is that the investment time frame is actually relatively short.
Yeah.
Because here's where the potential conflict is, because when we look at that, I think you were telling me, Kerry, that it's about 2.4 years is the average time in sole care.
Yep.
So when you're looking at an investment time frame, we're actually looking at, well, what is an appropriate investment based on that time frame? So often you end up with defensive assets such as cash and fixed interest because of the short time frame and the risk associated with that. When you're looking at longer term growth assets, such as trying to redeploy this money back into growth assets, higher growth assets, property and shares, have a longer investment time frame and carry greater volatility. So you're looking at 5 years plus.
Yeah.
So the confusion here is really around, well, one is that you got to act in the best interest under your power of attorney versus an element that might get put aside, and then that power of attorney starts looking at, well, the replacement asset and do they manage that for the next generation depending on their overall wealth and what that looks like. So by selling the asset, you could potentially miss out on some capital growth in the property.
Yeah.
If you're flowing that through to actually go into a liquid assets such as cash, particularly in this ultra low cash rate environment we're in at the moment.
Yeah, and we've also got the added layer of COVID at the moment. Like we had a client who was living in Melbourne. For her to sell her house at the moment in the current environment in Melbourne where people, can't go and visit the home, they would not for her, keeping the home and selling it at a future date ended up being quite a better decision process. But it all comes down to where the property is located, where you are in the market, the property market cycle, and that all we as financial advisors don't necessarily advise on that, but it's just a consideration that you need to understand the real estate market as well and the potential of that home. So, and what do you do if there is excess cash, and how do you invest that at more than a cash rate for all the considerations that you were saying about timeframes? So,
all right, number 9.
Okay, so it sounds really easy to say, let's sell the house.
Yep.
Okay, but quite often someone has been in that house for 40, 45 years, and the bathroom may not have been renovated, or the kitchen may not be that good. So that whole decision around how do we prepare the house for this, and we had 2 brothers recently whose parents had been in their house. It was their childhood home, and they're like, Mum and Dad are fine there, but to rent it out is we're going to have to repaint it, we're going to have to do it up. And then both of them were busy professionals that didn't have time to do it themselves. Their parents didn't have the funds to do it. Both of them were didn't know how to navigate that whole process of who pays for what and how do we manage that process. So yes, we go sell the house, can sell it as it is, or would we be better off preparing it for sale? And then that comes down to rental as well, as what has to be done to the house to actually get it to a stage where we can rent it and get a reasonable tenant so that the house isn't doesn't deteriorate more. So that whole making the decision, the house has got to be sold, sometimes it's better to step back and go, okay, let's just hold on to it for 3 to 6 months, and then let's go through the process of actually getting it to sale ready or rental ready.
Yep, and a lot of considerations. I mean, you mentioned there that how does that get funded? Those renovations. So if there's capital within the individual's a portfolio, that's fine. If there's not, then we come back to this other individuals paying for these costs and making sure there's appropriate documentation and appropriate agreements in place so that, when an estate occurs, that they are reimbursed for those monies.
Yeah.
The one that I always look at that then is when you said if they've been in there for 40 years, is the time effort required and actual emotional energy around going through 40 years of hoarding stuff. So very, very few people have the discipline to keep things clean and tidy. So 40 years of personal belongings is a tough one to work through.
It is a tough one. And it's one more thing that you may not want to at this time when there's so many other changes happening to deal with. So, selling the house, it's a step back, think, and take some of these into consideration. And these aren't all the things that you should consider, but these were our top 10 that we came up with.
Yep. Speaking of, number 10.
Number 10, what's the potential rental income? So sometimes it may be that there isn't the funds to pay for the fees, and you may think that you have to sell the house, but you could potentially rent out the home and generate an income. So depending on where the house is and what state it is in, because not all houses are derelict after 40 years. Some people are very house proud, and some, it may be beneficial to have that income coming in to help fund the cash flow of the fees going forward. So and then that comes down to what's the rental market like, where the house is located, how much work has to be done. And one of the things that you probably need to consider is, if you're not selling the house, there's a lot of people that we're using that capital that they do have to actually pay for their accommodation costs. So there may not be that residual left to get the house up to rental status.
Yep. I think, going through those 10 and just listening to you talk there, Kerry, I think one of the things that really stands out for me is that there's so many variables to that was just one simple thing, the home.
Yes.
And so it's evident that that the decisions are just not that simple. And because there's so many variables, and because families and financial situations are unique to every individual, and they're all different, that not one size fits all or one approach fits all. So seeking advice around that is important. And equally important was the fact that we're only talking about one thing, the home. So there's a lot of other considerations when considering around funding arrangements, estates, and structuring someone's financial affairs for the purpose of aged care.
Yeah. And the other thing is that we're talking about from today, there is legacy rules and grandfathering around how a home should be treated and how fees were set up before 2014. So there's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration. So basically, we recommend that you get advice in this space. There's a lot to navigate. There's a lot that can impact. You don't want to be losing an income stream such as an age pension because you've done something that potentially has not given you a greater benefit. So, this is one small part of this big puzzle that we deal with.
Excellent. All right. So on that note, that covers off our session today. Any final words?
No.
Seek advice.
Seek advice.
Step
back, take it slow. Think of it and you don't have all the answers. Like, one of the things is this is a very stressful time in people's places, and nobody puts up their hand and says, hey, I want to go to aged care. So actually navigating that and understanding what is best for somebody, you need to not rush into these decisions. Don't make knee-jerk reactions. Seek out. And look, people say to me, oh, but can I look it up on Google? Google's not your friend with aged care because there has been so many changes. And people will refer to friends or say, my grandmother was in aged care, I know what it is. But it's like, well, was she there when you paid bonds instead of accommodation costs and things like that? So it's really important in this space to understand what you're looking at and whether it's Commonwealth legislation, whether it's state legislation, because we're talking aged care facilities under Commonwealth. Sometimes retirement villages may have some of the same terminologies and have access to care, but that's state-based legislation. So we help people who are looking at lifestyle changes as well as people who are looking at care changes. So helping people understand what their options are in those later years of retirement.
Excellent. So make contact with Kerry, get some clear direction when you need it most, and hopefully you'll find the burden a little bit more lighter.
Yeah, hopefully we can help you through that.
Excellent. Thanks, Kerry, for making the complex more simple, and thanks everyone for joining us on our 10 questions about how to fund aged care, focusing on the home.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.